With our categories endpoint complete, now we're going to apply this to our client and get these into the navigation. Now we don't have any navigation at the moment, we just have our default layout with not much. So if you go over to the course resources, you'll find this really basic Bollman markup for the navigation. So go ahead and grab this, copy this over, and we're going to go ahead and create a partials directory inside of layouts, and then in here we're going to create our navigation component. So let's build this out and create out our template and just pop that code into there. So really simple, and we'll get this onto every page. So inside of here, let's go ahead and just export our default object in here. Let's go ahead and import the navigation component that we've just created, and that is from, we can either do @layout partials and navigation, or you can just go back a directory. And then into here, we're going to go ahead and list out the components that we want to use, which is of course navigation. So up here, we can just go ahead and create that self-closing navigation component, and we should see this up here. So I've created an example button over here and just a back to home button here, which we should probably fill in. So let's go ahead and do this. Now inside of Nuxt, if you've not worked with it before, we have a Nuxt link. What this will do is allow you to get rid of the href, it will generate that for you, and specify where you want this to go to. So we're going to say name index. That will just lead us back to the home page when we click on this. Okay, so now that we've got this in here, we need to think about how this is going to work. Now, before we even think about doing this, the first thing I'd recommend you do is go ahead and grab Vue.js DevTools. This is going to really help you out. Look inside of your store when we get Vuex set up, and as well as other things as well. So you can inspect your components, see what props you have in there, the data that you have in there, and it works wonders. So go ahead and grab this depending on which browser you're using, and we can go ahead and get started on pulling these categories in. Now the next thing that we need is the Axios module for Nuxt. So we're going to go ahead and install this, get this set up, and then we can make a request through to our API endpoint to grab this out. So if we just come over to our setup section here, let's go ahead and do an npm install on Nuxt.js Axios. So let's come over to our Cot client just here and pull this in and make sure we save that out. Okay, so now that's done, let's head over to the documentation, and all we really need to do is add this as a module, and then we're going to go ahead and add a setting in here for our base URL. So we just come over to Nuxt config, go ahead and add in our modules in here, which of course is Axios, and then we're going to go ahead and set up some config for this so we don't have to keep repeating the base URL for our application. So to do this, we just say base URL. You can pull this from environment configuration if you want to, but in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and grab this just to be a little bit quicker and pop that straight into there. So we essentially have Axios set up now, and every request that we make to our application, what we want to do is hydrate the Vuex store that we're going to create out in just a second with the category information, because this is something that needs to be available for every single page. What we don't want to do is inside of the navigation make an Ajax request after the component has mounted, because what we're going to end up with is seeing what we see at the moment, waiting maybe a second or two, obviously on a slower environment, to see them categories load in, and then they'll be added to the navigation. We want these to be immediately available. So let's focus on that next. Let's go over and create out a index inside of store. This will activate the Vuex store within Nuxt. So let's create index.js, and we now have a Vuex store inside of our application. So to test this out, let's go ahead and export a state out here like so. This is going to have the categories in by default, and that's just going to be an empty array. Now we can check this by going over to Vuex, and if we just give this a refresh, you can see that we've got our base state inside of here with them categories which are currently empty. So what we want to do is when our Nuxt application loads, we want to make an Ajax request or an HTTP request to our backend, to the categories endpoint, and then populate these categories. So hopefully you have some knowledge of Vuex. If you don't, I'd highly recommend you kind of read up on this before you start. But essentially we're going to go ahead and create an actions object inside of here, and we're going to have something called Nuxt server init. So let's create this as an async operation. Nuxt server init. What this will allow us to do is go ahead and make a request before we load the application, and then go ahead and commit something. So let's create a response variable in here and go ahead and await on this Axios, which is the module that we've just pulled in, get. Be really careful to use the $ here. What this will do is it will get rid of the need to say response.data.data, and it will just mean you can say .data, which is the wrapper inside of our API. So let's go ahead and make a request to our categories endpoint. Remember, we already have the base URL stored. And then let's go ahead and commit, let's say set_categories to response.data, and that should go ahead and fill this in, of course, once we create the mutation. So let's go ahead and export some mutations in here, and let's say set categories. This will of course take in our state and the categories that we want to set, and we just say state.categories categories. So before our application loads, we make a request to the backend, commit our mutation to go ahead and update the store, and we should see this. So let's give this a refresh, and sure enough we do. So we've now got the parent category in here, and then we have the children, and that happens before the page loads, so we don't see that kind of flicker of no content. Okay, so the next thing to do inside of here, I'm just going to copy this to save a little bit of time, is create a getter for our categories. So let's just call this categories, and let's just return state categories. Pretty straightforward, so we can grab them inside of our navigation. So if we come over to our layouts, over to partials and over to navigation, what we can now do is create a script section down here. Let's just pull this down a little bit. Go ahead and of course export our default object in here. In here, go ahead and import map getters, and this comes from Vuex. And then in here, we're going to go ahead and create some computed properties, or just one computed property, which is spreading out map getters, grabbing the categories from the categories in our base store. So that's pretty much all we're doing. Now, if we just come down here and output them categories, we should see that JSON, or of course, array of objects now output in the top. So all we now need to do is just go through and iterate through them categories, through all the children, and output what we want to see. So let's go ahead and do this now. This is exactly the place that we need to do this, just after the navigation end. So in here, we're going to go ahead and create a div with a class of navbar menu. And in here, we'll have each menu item. So just as an example, let's say 1, and let's give this a class of navbar items. That's what we're pretty much aiming for. If we just wait for that to finish, we want to be able to hover over this and see any of the parents or the children of that parent as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this as a parent. So let's set parent ID to null. Let's set 1, 2 as the order, and let's create another item in here which will be child 1. So let's say child 1, and the parent there will be 1. And let's say child 2, and we'll set that to the parent ID of 1 as well. And for these, we can get rid of the order unless you want them to be ordered inside of the children as well. So what we're now going to do is we'll keep this. I'm just going to cut that out so we can paste it back in a minute. Create an empty template so you don't have to introduce any additional markup. And we're going to say for category in categories. And then inside of here, we're going to create out the Nuxt link for these. Now for the Nuxt link, if we just end that there as well, this is going to have the key on it. So we need to key these by some kind of unique property attached to that category. So we're going to say category.slug. And the reason that we're doing that is we're going to have a couple of if statements inside of here to render out things depending on whether the item has children, and we can't add a key to a template. So a key just uniquely identifies each item so it knows how to update. So this is the Nuxt link. All we need to do inside of here is say category name, and for the Nuxt link we're going to go ahead and add in the class of navbar item. So we didn't really need to copy and paste that, but that's fine. So now what we should see if we head over to the browser and give that a refresh, we get an error here, and that is just because we haven't added in our toProp. So let's just say we're going to go to the home page for now. We'll update that later, of course, to click through to the right place. So we've got 1 and 2 here. Now what we need to do is figure out the drop down functionality for if it does have children, and that's where that if statement comes in. So inside of each of these items, we're now going to have another template in here to render out this and the drop down if we have children. Otherwise, we're just going to output something like this. So you can fiddle around with this depending on how you want this to work, but I found that this is the clearest way. So if category children length, so if we actually have any children in there, then we want to go ahead and create a similar link. So we're just going to copy and paste this over, and let's pull these down so this becomes a bit clearer. This time the class though is going to have is hoverable and has drop down. So that's the only difference we're going to do in there. And we are going to create a template in here, wrap the link here in there. You don't necessarily need to do that, and this is going to be the VElse. So if a category has children, we're going to output that link but with a drop down. So at the moment it looks a little bit funny, but of course we're going to fix this up in a second. And then we'll have the navbar drop down just underneath this. And the reason that this looks a little bit funny is we actually need to create a div wrapper for this, and that's going to have the class of navbar item. So let's go ahead and add this into here instead. And then this is going to go inside of that navbar item here because it has to be wrapped for that drop down to work. And then this is going to have a class of navbar link. So of course you can check out the Bulma documentation if you prefer. Okay, so let's go and just get rid of this key here and add this to this outer element here, because of course we need the key to be the immediate child element. And you can see now that we have the following. So we have a drop down and we have that nice little arrow there. So now is the chance to build the actual drop down. So this is going to be a class of navbar drop down, and then we're going to have a link inside of here. So we can just go ahead and copy and paste each of these. This is now going to be a navbar item though, and we are going to iterate over. So we're going to say v4 and let's say child in category.children. Let's give this a key of child.slug, and let's say child.name. And that should be just about everything we need to get this working. You can see that now we have both of them children. So now that we've done this, we might as well hook this up to a categories page so we don't forget. So let's come over to our pages directory and create a categories directory, and then inside of here let's create an _slug.view file. This will be the page where we pass through the category that we want to see the products for, and that will of course be the slug, and then this will show out the products for a category that we have chosen. Now the way that Nuxt works is this will build out for you the structure. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to register a root for this. It will just automatically work. So let's just take the Nuxt link here and let's switch this over to categories slug, and then let's create a parameters property in here, and we'll say slug is category.slug. And essentially what we can now do is click through this and that will go to categories 2. We don't see anything at the moment inside of here, and in actual fact if we head over to the slug page here, that doesn't look like it's working because we don't have a script outputting our objects. Let's do that, and there we go. So now we can click through this and that will go through to the page that we want. Now these won't work at the moment, so we can just go ahead and really quickly fix these up. So let's grab this in here and let's do the same for this Nuxt link here, and that will be category slug, but of course this one will be slightly different. It will be child.slug. So now, as well as having them output, we can click child 1, that goes through to that category, child 2, that goes through to that category, and so on. And we can access this parent by clicking that as well. So there we go. That is loading in our categories for every single page request, making sure our store is hydrated before we output these to the page, and of course making them go through to that categories page that we'll look at a little bit later. So we're all done with our categories.